If the head of state, like a president, a king or a queen or a prime minister, somebody like that, if one of those kind of people, head of state, were to visit another head of state, say, visit the White House, you could imagine, I think, what kind of vehicle that head of state would drive to the White House in, couldn't you? Could you imagine that? Of course, he wouldn't be driving, he'd be riding. Kind of something like this? Yeah? Would you agree? Yeah, okay, good. It's a statement, it's a statement about how important this person, how great this person is who's riding in this car. I think any one of us would feel pretty important. In fact, if we were to get into a car like this, a limousine, beautiful, comfortable limousine, we'd say, oh, this is great. Yeah? No? Of course, you probably can't even begin to imagine yourself riding in a car like that. I know I can't. Because only great people, truly great people, important people, powerful people, ride around in cars like that. Pope Francis, on the other hand, is a head of state, of course. You know that. The Vatican is a state. It's a city-state. In charge of the church, as it were. Important person, pretty powerful person. I think you'd agree with that. You'd think that he'd pull up at the White House if he were to visit the White House and something like that. Except maybe the only difference would be it was white. Come on, that's funny. Well, 3 years ago, in fact, it was just 3 years ago that Pope Francis did visit the White House. He came to the United States and he visited the White House, and without saying a word, he made a very huge statement about what it means to be great, because this is what he drove up in the White House in. And you can see, if you look close, you can see him in the back seat. Do you see him there? Up there he is. Yeah. Newly arrived in the country, hadn't said a word, but he made a point, a very powerful point, very powerful message. The discipleship is about following Jesus, obviously. It's a journey. Every journey, as you all know, is made up of steps, one step at a time. And that's what this series really is about, this series on discipleship and the steps to discipleship. So each week we've been looking at a different step, and the next step that we're going to be looking at this weekend is the one that is really about being great. It's Jesus' promises. Take this step and you will achieve greatness in your life. Because the truth is, every one of us wants to be great in some way or another. We don't want to be mediocre. We don't want to simply be okay. We want to be great. Maybe you're not thinking of great, because maybe you're saying, I don't want to be great. I'm happy with the way I am right now. What more do I need? Greatness. We all want to be great. Maybe not like a celebrity with lots of fame and fortune. Maybe not like that, but definitely we want to be the best in our class. Every one of you who are parents, you want to be a great parent, right? No? You don't want to be great parents? You don't want your children to grow up saying, my mom and dad are the greatest? Yes, you do. Everyone does. It's true. It's true. Everyone who works, pick a profession, whatever you do, you want to be great at what you do. Grandparents, you want to be well, maybe you don't want to be great grandparents, I don't know. I'm a great uncle. I work hard to maintain my status as a great uncle, as the great uncle. Anyhow, given the choice between greatness and mediocrity, how many of us are going to choose to be mediocre? No, we're going to choose greatness. It's the reality. But sometimes we do give up on greatness because it seems so elusive. It doesn't seem like it's something that we can achieve. In fact, it might even come at a cost. Greatness might come at a cost, and we've tried and failed, and at least that's just the way it seems. It's kind of the way we feel. And we might feel that way because we look at our lives and we say, I'm not making as much money as I thought I should, so I must not be all that great. I'm not going to get the promotion that I deserve because I'm great. Well, maybe I'm not all that great. Maybe retirement isn't what I hoped it would be. And so, life just isn't all that great. Maybe you come into the realization you don't have the skills that you thought you needed to get a job done. I can't do that. I must not be all that great. Maybe your kids are growing up to be ungrateful brats. Yeah? Or they have grown up and become ungrateful brats. And you say to yourself, I failed as a parent. I'm no good. In fact, you might even be thinking, what difference do I really make? What difference does my life really make? Whether it's at home, at work, even here in church, what difference do I make? You know, ultimately, greatness is a choice. It's a lifestyle choice. It's a step in life that every one of us can choose or not choose to take. To understand that choice, what I want to do is take a look at the 9th chapter of Mark's Gospel. We heard a little bit of it last week, and I want to go back to what we heard last week, and then a little bit of today's Gospel. And in last week, we heard Mark tell us that they, the disciples and Jesus, came to Capernaum, and once inside the house, Jesus, began to ask them, what were you arguing about on the way? What are you arguing about? Of course, Jesus went on many journeys, many trips with his disciples. He took them along with him. And you know, when they would go home, they'd go to Capernaum, the town where they lived. And on this particular journey, they were apparently arguing with one another, kind of like many kids do in the back seat of the car, right, parents? Yeah, they sit in the back seat and they argue with one another. Happens, right? Not in my family, it never happened. Believe that, I'll tell you another story. And of course, you parents probably know exactly what it is that they're arguing about. At least sometimes you do. And Jesus did as well. He knew what they were arguing about, so that when they arrived home, he questioned them about it. Because he wanted to challenge them, but at the same time, he wanted to provide them an opportunity to learn. He wanted a teaching experience. And we hear in the next verse what they were arguing about. Because when he questioned them, they remained silent. Because they had been discussing among themselves who was the greatest. You see, their thinking was conditioned by the fact that they thought that Jesus, at some point, was going to be made the next king. And because they were in his inner circle, they were part of the important group. They were the ones. They figured, wow, we're going to really, make out in this. We're going to enjoy positions of power and influence. But then, being human, because we tend to do this, that wasn't enough. They were arguing about which one of us is going to be the most powerful, which one of us is going to have the most influence. You see, you have to understand that the apostles and even early disciples, the early followers of Jesus, they didn't follow Jesus for altruistic, selfless reasons. They didn't follow Jesus. They weren't following him out of holiness or virtue. They didn't understand that he was going to die on the cross. When he said that, it was like, what are you talking about? And then to rise from the dead, that was just so outside of their way of thinking, they couldn't even begin to imagine what he meant. They followed Jesus because they thought that one day they would profit in a worldly way when he got to be who it appeared that he was going to be, a king. So their discussion is, of course, about how they will profit and who will profit the most. They were jockeying for position because that's what people do. They did it then, we do it now. Rank is important. Where do you stand in the ranking? Now, that being said, it has happened to me over the years that I have had conversation with folks, parents of young children, after Mass. I like to stand and talk to folks after Mass. And when you have a conversation with parents of young children, those of you with young children know very well that they tend to get a little antsy. They don't like the fact that mom and dad are wasting their time, and so they go find something better to do. And in church, they go explore. And that's not such a bad thing. Inevitably, a young child, and it has happened, will climb up onto my chair. And of course, the reaction of parents to a little child climbing up on my chair is priceless. But before I tell you what their reaction is, and maybe some of you already know this reaction, Let me tell you the way a young child, and I'm thinking 3, 4-year-olds, let me tell you the way they think. And it's really simple. Again, it has happened on more than one occasion where a young child with their family is leaving church, and on the way out of church, walking past as their mom and dad are saying hello, goodbye, the little child says, "Hi, God." You think I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. You know, that's the mind of a child. You know, in a child's eye, a child recognizes that there's something special about a priest, and sitting in his chair is like, wow, that is the coolest thing. So the response, of course, to the parents is, oh, you can't sit there, don't, that's not for you, you don't go there, that's, get down from there. And my response is, why? It's just a chair. Now, I understand it's a chair in a special kind of way, but why? Because all the child wants to do is sit with God. Or at least, the closest thing that a child can find to God. You see, children, is the technical word, they don't dissemble. They don't distinguish. They don't understand rank. Makes no sense to them. They don't care. Everyone's the same in their eyes. As we grow older, we do like to make lists. We do like to rank people and then figure out where we are in the ranking. Now, that can be helpful if we use that as a way to clarify our own values and priorities in our own lives. But it really, and more often than not, becomes destructive and debilitating. Because in our flawed human nature, we fall into a comparison trap. We compare ourselves to one another, and it is a trap because it makes us feel bad about ourselves. Oh, I'm not up here. I'm only down here. I really want to be up here. It makes us feel bad because we don't rise up to that comparison. Or it can make us feel bad about the other person. Well, that person's up there, and who does she think she is? That's the danger, and that's what's going on with the gospel and the disciples in the gospel. And Jesus takes the 12 and gathers them to himself, and he says, if anyone wishes to be first. And, it's really important to hear that statement, if anyone wishes to be first. That's a big if. It's not no one can be first. It's if you want to be first. If you want to be first, if you want to be great, that's a good thing. Aim for greatness. Jesus isn't saying don't aim for greatness. He's not against it. God wants you to be great. Every one of you. No matter how we slice it, Christianity is not about wimpiness and mediocrity, the opposite of greatness. To be a Catholic Christian is to be great. That's what God wants. Discipleship is about greatness. And by all means, every one of us should aim our lives to greatness. Except that Jesus takes the human definition of greatness and turns it on its head, because he says, if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last and the servant of all. You see, instead of it being about power over people, it's about power for people. It's about service to people. And that's the next step to discipleship. That word that we use for that service here is ministry, to be a minister. And being a minister is very different than being a volunteer. There's a big difference. And oftentimes, sadly, we confuse those two. We think they're the same, really. But they're not. Ministers serve the needs of others. Volunteers, on the other hand, well, they serve themselves, quite frankly. If I want to volunteer for something, I'm going to do it on my own terms. But if I minister, I do it on God's terms. True greatness comes from being a minister who serves the needs of others. And that greatness means leveraging our abilities, our talents, our skills, our opportunities, the influences that we have, the advantages, the resources, the skills, all the things that God has given us, leveraging that for the good of others, for the benefit and well-being of others, without expecting anything in return. Let me go back to the gospel for a moment. In that story, the next step of that story, Jesus, we heard this last week, takes a child, a small child, takes the child, places it on his lap, puts his arm around the child, and then uses that child as an example of this is what it means to be one who follows me, to be a servant. This is what it means. And you can imagine Jesus holding this child on his lap, and then we hear in today's gospel, John stands up and says, but Jesus, there was somebody, they're not part of us. They don't belong to us. How come? What's going on? And Jesus stops him. He stops him. And we hear in Mark's gospel today, he says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, and that's a really important statement, whoever causes the little one to sin, whoever causes the child to commit a sin. It would be better for him if a great millstone were put around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. The sin that we cause is not necessarily something that we do to the child, although it may be, but more so, it's the example or the lack of example that we set for the child. By not setting a good example for a child, we risk causing that child to do the same and therefore to sin. The greatest example is that we set an example through the service that we render to one another, which Jesus is calling every one of us to do. And that act of service can be large or small. It matters not in God's way of thinking. In fact, to have a servant's heart, well, it's been verified through research that to have a servant's heart expands our hearts and makes it bigger and makes us grow and helps us to grow in our faith. And that service is an attitude of the heart that needs to be put into practice every day of our lives. Something that we have to intentionally do. And that might mean putting it on your schedule, putting it on your calendar. I am going to do this, an act of service today. And this is my job to do. It becomes part of a lifestyle. So when we say ministry, when I talk about ministry, I'm speaking specifically about ministry right here in this parish, in your parish. That means service to one another. It means serving God in one another, giving of your time. Some for time to time, some of you maybe on a more regular basis. In other words, get out of the pew and do something. The parking ministers serve in our parking lot to create a sense of welcome, as well as the greeters in the back of church opening the door for you. Isn't it nice to have somebody open the door for you? Kids ministers. There's kids small groups after Mass today, but all the other kids ministries that we have, serving and looking after the next generation so that they can become ministers as well. And then ministers who serve the needs of our elderly and our homebound. There's obviously all kinds of other wonderful ministries, too many for me to get into right now. But as I've said from the beginning of this series, it's not about doing everything all at once. It's about taking one step at a time. And maybe ministry is the next step to which God is calling you today, right now. And if he is, then next Tuesday evening, here in our hall, it's October 9th, we'll have an orientation to ministry where you can learn about all our parish ministries and what it means to be a minister, really in more detail than I can get into now. In the meantime, after Mass, you heard Lisa mention that there's some great stuff in the hall. It's an opportunity to take a look and see what all the ministries are that we have here. And there's many, many ways to help, and everybody can do something. I really encourage you to go to the hall, walk out this way, walk this way, and find out what's going on. See, ministry is about service in the parish. It's the path to greatness. Every one of you including myself, we all want to be great. God wants us to be great. And discipleship is nothing more than following Jesus step by step. A little bit more today than yesterday, a little bit more tomorrow than today. And in the process, we quickly discover that life has more meaning. It's much more successful. Now, I know many of you have already taken this step, but for those of you who haven't, is the path to greatness through service the next step that God is calling you to?